Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here is your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Good morning, everyone. It is Monday, June 30th, 2025, and welcome to another conversation in season 4 of the People in Fundraising nonprofit podcast series. Today, I am really excited to welcome Christina Martin Kenny to People in Fundraising and to have her share her career story, her new company that just recently launched, and for me and for a lot of other people in nonprofit world on LinkedIn, familiar with Christina's content about navigating professional and personal lives. You do a great job talking about it and shining a light on those topics, Christina. So if you want to first take a moment and tell our audience a little bit about yourself, we would appreciate that.
Thanks, Tim. I'm thrilled to be here. I am, as Tim said, I'm Christina Martin Kenny. I am a career fundraising. It is all I have ever done since I was an intern, which is really how I got my started in fundraising back when I was in college. Today, I am the founder of the newly launched Guava Tree Strategies, which is a consulting firm that supports organizations at the intersection of sustainable fundraising strategy and staff retention, two things that I really believe don't go hand in hand, but should, to support organizations in their paths towards more sustainable futures for themselves, their people, and the people that they serve.
Wonderful. Where can people find more information about Guava Tree and you on LinkedIn and other platforms that you and or your company are on?
Yeah, well, my website is guavatreestrategies.com. I have a newsletter that comes out every Thursday that takes a little bit of what I normally talk about on LinkedIn, but is a little bit more candid, a little bit more saucy and in-depth about some of the things I'm talking about. And then, yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So I think on there it's just LinkedIn/CM Kenny. And I'm not one of those LinkedIn content creators who like has a strategy and posts every day. I just kind of post what's on my mind. I'm a runner and do my best thinking when I run. And so sometimes I'll stop mid-run and, post on the iPhone notes app of, this popped into my head. I'm going to write a post on LinkedIn about this.
That's awesome. And that's how you and I got connected. I think I first got familiar with your name. I would see you comment on other people in my network and thought, man, like Christina's onto something, and I think again with Guava Tree, what you're doing there too about sustainable practices and staff retention, and talking about just the challenges that come with people very passionate about working in nonprofit, but also feeling burned out on the work front and balancing it all with their personal lives too.
Yeah, I mean, nonprofit people, whether they're in fundraising or not, are some of the hardest working, most passionate people I've ever met. Everybody who works in the nonprofit space is doing it because they're deeply connected to an issue they care about. And I think that's something that you just don't see in the private sector, right? People might join a private sector company because it's something they believe in, or just because it was, a product they believe in or use. But when it comes to nonprofits, you have people working for cancer research organizations because they lost someone they loved to cancer, or animal shelters because they, have rescue pets who have changed their lives. And there really is this deep connection. Everybody has such a tie to the mission. And that is where I think why I'm so active about the disconnect in how staff are treated and the staff retention issues we have, because I think when people leave a nonprofit role, it's often pretty heartbreaking. It's not just, oh, I'm leaving for a bigger, better opportunity. There is really this 7 stages of grief that accompany leaving many nonprofit roles, of coming to terms with the fact that you have to leave and accepting it and grieving a loss of a mission that you were deeply tied to and worked hard for. I don't think that exists in other places, right? And I
Right.
think that is a testament to just how hardworking people are in this space. And when it came time for me to decide on my next step, I couldn't imagine leaving the sector. This is all I've ever done.
Yeah.
And that's why I really wanted to focus on staff retention. And I thought,
Mm.
how can I use my skills as a fundraiser and this passion I have for supporting nonprofit people in the workplace and create something that supports organizations doing both of these things? And
Sure.
so that's how it was born.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And Christina, if we can rewind the career clock and
Yeah.
start, um, you mentioned you got into nonprofit work as an intern. So if you could take, 5, 10 minutes and tell our audience how you went from an intern to deciding to stay in the field and launching Guava Tree Strategies, please.
Sure. So when I was in college, I was studying political science and international development
Hmm.
and journalism. I knew I didn't want to be a journalist. I had come to that realization while I was several credits deep. Um, but I also knew I didn't want to work in politics. I was really drawn to the nonprofit space, specifically the international development side of things. And I was studying abroad in the UK. And the program that I studied abroad with gave you the option to take classes in another country or do an internship. And I opted to do the internship.
Okay.
And they had this great matching program and matched me with a women's rights nonprofit that was started in the United States, but was opening their UK office. And so there was one full-time staff member. It was the executive director.
Yeah.
And I was brought on to be everything, anything and everything. And so, with so many internships are, but because this was this new to the UK nonprofit,
Hmm.
right? Most of my role fell to fundraising. How do we, the US office was supporting financially up to a certain point. So it was like
Hmm.
in this first year of operation, we have to raise this much money and build a donor base and build a community of supporters so that this organization can succeed.
Yeah.
And it
Wow.
was fascinating. And because the organization had one full-time staff and me, I really got to do everything. I was very donor facing. I met the first lady of the UK.
Wow.
I had experiences that most interns and junior staff at organizations just really never see.
Definitely.
And it was such a learning curve, but it was really just a wonderful experience of building a nonprofit from the ground up in a lot of ways, right? What does it
Yeah.
look like to connect with donors and have board members host small, intimate dinners, but then also be working with government agencies on um legislative issues that our organization supports, right? It was so many different things.
Yeah.
And as I was leaving that internship, my manager said, if you want to work in the nonprofit space and you want to ultimately work in nonprofit leadership, the fast track to that is through fundraising.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
stick with fundraising and you will have so many doors open for you, right?
Yeah.
And um, I graduated from college during the economic recession in
Wow.
2009,
Mm.
and she actually moved back to the United States later and hired me
Okay.
for wherever she was working in the US.
Huh.
And so I got to work with her again. But, she said when there's economic downturns, when there's uncertainty, nonprofits always need fundraisers. It's a very stable career path. And,
So,
to a 22-year-old college graduate, that sounded like really great advice, but it was also just immediately like, this is what I need to be doing. I should be
yeah.
working in fundraising, right?
Yeah.
So I know there's people always say, oh, I fell into fundraising. And in a way, I kind of did, but at the same time, I didn't fall into nonprofits. That was very intentional. What I was
Yeah.
going to do for those nonprofits was really, up in the air. And this internship was really a valuable way to learn that. And it's all I've ever done.
That's awesome. Awesome. It must have been so nice to marry that experience as the intern and then to learn like here are the skills I've developed, the skills I have already, and now to know the interest, the passion on this side, I want to now get onto the path of doing the actual fundraising,
Yeah.
having that
Yeah.
clarity.
Yeah. I think I really have such a soft spot for small and startup nonprofits because there's so much potential. And I know that that's always the hardest fundraising to do, but maybe because that's where I started, right? Is like, we're going to do this. We're opening this UK office.
Yeah.
We've got to fundraise from the ground up. I really think back a lot to what I was doing then and what I was learning. And I
Mm.
think so much of those lessons are relevant to really shaping a program. And I think so many organizations just start fundraising, and then they don't build the systems at the same time because they're just in this
Right.
constant state,
Yeah.
right? And when you take the time to build the systems and the infrastructure, which fortunately this organization did because they
Mm.
had a successful US office, that was, they're a thriving organization several years later today, right?
Oh,
That's
awesome.
generating millions of pounds a year to support, their continued operation. And so I really, systems and structure and foundational work is such a core part of what I'm doing to support my nonprofit clients.
That's awesome. So great. And where did you go from there, Christina?
Well, that was an internship. So then I finished school, and then I did a, year-long, not in fundraising, research assistant position doing research work on actually on human trafficking. And then I went and did my master's in continued in international development.
Okay.
And then from there, I was in New York for grad school, desperately wanted to be in the DC area. I just really, really loved it here. And so came here and was really only looking for jobs in the DC area. And yeah, I went right into nonprofit. And the
Yeah.
first organization I went to was an organization that was combating money in politics.
Mm.
And I was there for 9 months when the organization had a $1 million budget. 50% of that funding came from one individual who passed away 9 months into my term there.
Ooh, wow.
And the organization, they didn't fold. There was a merger, but most of the staff was laid off.
Mm.
And again, a really eye-opening introduction to revenue diversification and
Yes.
sustainable fundraising, right? So much of it has come full circle because that, my first full-time job out of grad school, I was there less than 9 months,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they didn't have any kind of, and it was unexpected for this donor to pass away, and there was no contingency plan. We had this emergency staff meeting, and by the end of the week, everybody was laid off, or at least most of the staff.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Man, some rough starts there.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all been a lesson, and I've always been somebody that's very hardworking. And so I mentioned before that I'm a runner. I walked out of this organization knowing I was being laid off, went across the street to the local running store and started working there until I found my next position,
Yeah.
and my next position was at a massive, like multi-$100 million organization. And they
Mm.
hired me as a grant writer because they
Oh.
wanted to build a grants program.
Mm.
They hadn't had one before. And within a year, they started asking, where's the money? I said, I don't know. I've written $5 million worth of grants. We haven't heard back from any of them. We're not
Right.
supposed to hear back from any of them for a couple more months. And again, I think when I started getting really active on LinkedIn, it was this frustration of how many positions I've had have ended in a way that I just really didn't expect, either because, there wasn't a diverse revenue portfolio and people were laid off, or they
Yeah.
didn't understand the time it takes to write grants. And there, this is what happens in the sector, right? There's a
Right.
reason why. I mean, they say the average fundraiser lasts 18 to 24 months at an organization, but some estimates say it's as low as 16 months. And I believe every part of that. And
Cool.
that's the key. That's what I'm talking about, right? That's the issue I'm trying to solve is why are your fundraisers leaving every 18 to 24 months? It's not because we just can't hire good fundraisers, right? It's
Yeah.
because you don't have the systems in place, your expectations are too high, there's quite a lot. There's a lot of reasons.
Oh yeah, and I worked at one place where the onboarding process was so bad that the newest hire didn't even last 2 weeks. I met with the fundraiser to roll out her portfolio, and about 3 business days later, she was gone.
Wow.
And her most pressing reason was the onboarding process was so terrible, outdated, not clear. And I'm like, if we could lose someone for that reason before they even start engaging, that is a systemic failure on our part.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that I work with clients on is, okay, you're hiring a new fundraiser, right? And first of all, what does your job description look like?
Yeah.
Should you be hiring a director of development? Because this is not a real statistic, but if I had to guess, 8 times out of 10, somebody's hiring a director of development to raise more money when what they actually need is a data manager or a grants manager or
Right.
somebody who isn't as, director level because you don't have certain things in place to hire somebody to actually direct a program and implement strategy, and so
Absolutely.
it's writing the job description so that it doesn't have 35 bullet points. And then it's looking at their onboarding and
Yeah.
setting a very specific, I was once at an organization, I was 6 weeks into the job, and they said, you need to plan a gala, and the gala has to happen 3 months from today. And it was not a successful gala. I will say that.
Well,
Because there was no pipeline.
yeah.
Who were we going to invite? There was, no real reason to throw a gala. It wasn't something the organization did. It was nobody's worried about the pandemic anymore. So let's bring people together in person and throw a party. Um,
Set up for failure.
yes, how not to onboard your new staff,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I think really when organizations think about onboarding, especially at a director level, I think it should last somewhere like 6 months.
Hmm.
And I think part of that onboarding should be building up a portfolio and establishing systems and
Yeah.
doing an analysis. Is your CRM working for you? What's your donor retention rate? What are the pain
Right.
points that your organization needs to fix before you can start thinking? Because very rarely are organizations taking the time to do all of these things. And then they hire somebody and say, here's a portfolio, go
Right.
for it. Have
Right.
fun. I mean, that would be the dream, right? Although in higher ed, they do that. But that's, I think it's a pretty big exception.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Good stuff. Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts, Christina,
Yeah.
and your journey here. Um, I'd like to get into some of the quotes on the questionnaire. I try to draw quotes, references, thoughts from people both in the nonprofit world and definitely outside of it. And so we got a few quotes. Uh, One from David Bowie, who's one of my favorite musicians ever. Um, and I wanted to tie it into the issues that you highlight so eloquently on LinkedIn about the challenges in nonprofit workforce, especially for working mothers.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear how this quote may resonate with your experience. So it's from the late David Bowie, who said, quote, if you feel safe in the area you're working in, you're not in the right area. Always go a little further into the water. than you feel you're capable of being in, just a bit out of your depth. And when you don't feel that your feet are quite touching the bottom, you're just about in the right place to do something exciting. And I would just maybe think that perhaps, Guava Tree Strategies would be that something exciting and a new development for you. But how does that quote speak to you, Christina?
Yeah, I I don't think there's anything safe about being in fundraising. It is
Mm.
always different. It's always an adventure.
Yeah.
One of the things that drew me to consulting specifically, I worked at a consulting firm several years ago, and it was immensely challenging work. It was a grant writing firm. We used to write 30 grants a month on average. Um, it was a tough job, right?
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I thrived off of it. One, because I didn't have kids yet. And two, because I would go from, I'm working on a grant proposal to an organization that is working with DC youth and running youth programs. And then I'm working with an organization that's fighting financial protection, for better financial protections for Americans. And then from there, I'd go to an organization that's working on gun violence prevention, and then immigration and refugee programs, like just all over the place. And
Sure.
it was so fun to just always be bouncing, and my mind was constantly turning, right? I think there comes a point where if you start to get bored in your role, which happens a lot,
Sure.
then that's when, right, that kind of comfort, you kind of become complacent. And there's
Absolutely.
no real space for that when you're in consulting and you are working with different organizations and different causes and different missions.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons why this was the right step for me, is to really be able to do that. I thought I have a lot of experience with the same types of organizations, either political democracy focused organizations or human rights and refugee and immigration work.
Mm.
And I intentionally did not um, brand myself as a fundraiser to those kinds of organizations, because
Okay.
I believe that what I'm trying to support organizations with really goes beyond your mission, right? If you are
Yeah.
an animal shelter, you can, benefit from sustainable fundraising and staff retention just as much as the next organization. And I don't necessarily think that the kind of work I'm doing requires any kind of specific knowledge about a certain issue that can't really be learned, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I think, you said it, you mentioned about motherhood, and something that I think about a lot when I was at that firm writing 60 grants a month or 30 grants a month.
Right.
I left when I had my first baby
Yeah.
because my priorities shifted, and I didn't want to stay up late on a Friday night writing a grant that was due at 11:59 p.m. or submitting the grant after waiting 5 days for edits from the client.
Right.
And I think about this a lot, and it's something that I've been trying to find a way to have a conversation with other people in nonprofit, because one, we have a problem in this industry with not supporting younger staff, right? There's like
Mm.
no professional development.
Yeah.
Salaries leave room to be desired,
Totally.
and there are not opportunities for growth, right? We don't create roles, we hire for the position that we need. We don't hire with any kind of what could this person's role evolve into
Mm.
3 to 4 years after they've been in this job. And
Yeah.
so staff retention, it's not just poor for fundraising, it's poor for all nonprofit folks, but especially younger ones who are
Yeah.
hungry to grow their careers and take on more responsibilities.
Oh, totally.
But we're also seeing this shift in society where people, and not just women, are having children later in life.
Yes.
And so you have, you know, 25, 30 years ago, women were having their children and then climbing the corporate ladder, right? My
Right.
mom was an executive at a pharmaceutical company, And I was in high school when she became a director level and needed to start traveling for work more. And that was fine because she could leave me home by myself. I was 17, then I went to college, right?
Yes.
Now you have 38 to 42-year-olds. I mean, I'm just kind of spitballing an age range, but you have women and men who are coming into nonprofit leadership with babies and toddlers at home.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that's a shift.
Yes.
And you cannot work 60 hours a week and, and thrive at home when you
Right.
are waking up 4 or 5 times a night or dealing with the mental load of potty training and summer camp registration and milestones and all of the things that accompany parenting, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
the mental load is something completely separate, but let's just the being a parent to a small human is exhausting,
It
right?
is.
Whether you're sleeping or not,
Yeah.
there's just so much to it.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing this shift where people are burning out.
Yeah.
And part of it is a symptom of nonprofit work and that we're doing the work that is being left to nonprofits because of societal failures. But also part of it is because we're doing that work at the same time that we're getting ready for work for the day and facing a 25-minute meltdown because your 3-year-old wanted the red spoon and you gave them the red spoon,
Right.
you know? Um, and so it really these are kinds of the questions that I get to with motherhood is how do you support a thriving career in
Yeah.
nonprofit leadership when you have really small kids at home? My kids are 6 and 2. I am
Mhm.
very much in the thick of
You are.
early parenting, right? I still
Yes.
consider myself a new mom because I am, right?
Yeah.
And my husband's a commercial airline pilot. So
Yeah.
that adds an entire other layer of things is that, I'm doing this by myself. I would never call myself a single mom, but, most of the time it's just me.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
when school calls, we have this setup right now where he's home every weekend, which is wonderful. But that
Yeah.
means he usually works 4 days during the week. So the kids are home from school. That's me. I'm taking off from work, right?
Um,
Not him, because technically he could, but depending on where in the world he is, he might not be able to get home until the next day.
right. Yeah.
So I'm
Wow.
I'm really interested in how I don't think there's a lot, but I'm seeing more and more nonprofits that are leaning into this co-CEO model,
Mm.
co-leadership, and I really wonder if is that the shift toward the future, right? The
Oh,
other thing too is there are not a lot of part-time positions for nonprofit folks, right? I think about these organizations with 30 bullet points who want to hire a director of development, right? And I wonder, I'm like, what if you hired somebody, let's say your organization really has a strong need for a major gift strategist and a grant writer, right? I'm making
yeah.
this up. But what if you instead of trying to hire somebody who's really good at both of those things, what if you hired somebody at 20 hours a week who could be your major gift person and somebody else who at 20 hours a week who could be your grant strategist and they collaborate, right? And you can
Right.
build a nonprofit program that way, right?
Right.
To create more doors for people who need or want to work part-time because they're in this messy middle
Sure.
of leadership while child rearing, and then I'm not even going to, mention the sandwich generation piece of this,
That's what I was
right?
thinking too. Yeah.
You have people caring for you're caring for young children.
Yep.
You are I don't even like to say climbing the corporate ladder because I don't necessarily think it's a climb. Sometimes it's just a natural progression of your career, right?
Right.
Not everybody wants to lead a nonprofit, but everybody wants to, in a way, if you want to make more money, you have to, move into some kind
Yes.
of leadership, right? And as you
Absolutely.
get older and you have more responsibilities with families and kids, you do need more money.
Yes.
Um, But then you have aging parents,
Yeah.
right? So there's this kind of trifecta that is really affecting the workforce today. And this is not unique to nonprofits. This is across, the sector, or across just corporate America nonprofit. But I think with nonprofits, there is that added layer of you are working towards a mission that is solving societal issues. And so
Yes.
there is this deep sense of urgency to do the work and show up for it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And as you were talking, Christina, about, people having children later in life, when my wife had our first child, I was 32. And when my wife had our fourth child, I was 39. And we were blessed that she could stay at home. I was working full time in prospect research, but also like we wanted her to stay at home with our children, but also the incredibly onerous financial commitment that a lot of families have to take on to put young children in childcare was just way out of our reach. And for a lot of
Yeah.
people, it's similar. And there were a couple of times in those almost 7 years of having children and raising young kids where I was recruited for jobs out of state, or I'd throw my hat in the ring for positions and it just didn't work out. And at the time, it was like as you say, I think I needed to climb the ladder and advance my career. But you're also right that the mental exhaustion was real of raising young kids. And I felt like I had to race home every day to relieve my wife, who's been home with, one, two, three, four kids all day. And in hindsight, I'm like, there are some opportunities that I should not have even entertained because of that really tricky and daily fluctuating balancing act of being a
Yeah.
young parent.
Yeah. Yeah. It's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think a lot of people, are experiencing that and feeling like, the only way really up is to take on more, work harder, work longer, prove yourself capable. And that comes at the expense of mental health, personal health, family
Yeah.
dynamics too.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to shift, Christina, to a post you wrote on LinkedIn, and we've talked a little bit about your activity on that platform. About 6 months ago, you wrote a post about nonprofit leaders who are shifting to consulting for nonprofit organizations. And it got almost like 5,500 reactions and more than 500 comments.
Yeah.
And I just, as I was doing a little bit of the questionnaire research for this, I'm like, holy cow, like how exciting. And also, how did you manage like reacting to comments and what you thought about them? Um, so for two questions about that, did you anticipate that your post would generate such widespread reaction? And two, you concluded this insightful post by writing that we should be worried about why people are shifting into consulting and that this trend won't change, quote, your words, until organizations start viewing their staff as an investment into their mission, end quote. So let's first talk about, what you reacted to that post getting so much attention. And then I'll ask a follow-up question related to staffing being an investment.
Yeah. I mean, no, I had no idea. First of all, the LinkedIn algorithm is so weird that,
Yeah.
nobody can really gauge what's going to be a viral post. And
Yeah.
I certainly didn't expect that. I think it was one of those, like, I just posted it and then forgot about it. And then like LinkedIn emails you and tells you somebody commented on your post like 7 hours later. I was like, oh, I got a comment. Let me click on this. And it was like, oh, okay. There's a lot going on here. The biggest thing with that was just how many comments, but more importantly, direct messages I got from people saying, yes, I am in this position now, and I have been in nonprofit forever. I've always been a fundraiser, and I think this is my last job. Like, I can't do this anymore.
Wow.
And
Mm.
I think like Evan Wildstein and Michelle Flores-Bryn are doing the Social Impact Staff Retention Project. I think we have these numbers around staff retention, but then when you put those stories to it, it's pretty heartbreaking,
It
right?
is.
Of how many people just feel like beaten down and demoralized by the work that they're doing. This is supposed to be uplifting work.
Yeah.
And when people are just kind of coasting by and feeling like they cannot do this anymore,
Mhm.
we need a significant shift.
Totally.
Um, so with that quote, it comes from how many people have been told you have to raise your salary within your first year.
Mm.
Or the one that gets me is people who say, or nonprofit leaders who say, oh, we don't have a staff retention issue, just our fundraising team. And that's a problem, right? Like, that means I'm more worried about those organizations, right? Because it means that you
Yeah.
treat everybody else on your staff well and they want to stay and they're thriving and your
Right.
fundraisers are just barely hanging on, you know? I mean, there's so much to unpack with that, right?
Yeah.
There people always there's this new buzzword of right culture of philanthropy, and you start
Mhm.
seeing it in job descriptions. This position will be responsible for creating a culture of philanthropy at the organization.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
A culture of philanthropy means everybody is a fundraiser. We've all heard that before, but I've never actually been in an organization where everybody is a fundraiser.
Correct.
Instead, you often have a director of development who is a team of one,
Mm.
maybe two, who is solely responsible for raising their entire organization's budget,
Yep.
right? Somebody
Yeah.
reached out to me a couple months ago. They were for an organization that was losing federal funding
Mm.
rapidly,
Mm.
and their board said, you have to make up this several $1 million deficit by the end of Q2, or we're going to have to lay people off.
Oh,
I
goodness.
mean, that is insurmountable pressure to put
Yeah.
on an individual to say people are going to lose their jobs if I can't deliver.
Yeah.
And most people cannot deliver, right? The situation with the federal funding, or even what I shared about this $500,000 donor who passed away, right?
Yeah.
There are just some setbacks that you cannot come back from, right?
Correct.
And no amount of fundraising is going to help you raise millions of dollars in 6 months.
Yes. Yeah.
But we think that we can. I mean, we've all heard the story of the fundraiser who starts a position and is told, um, what's the budget? And they say, oh, we increased it by 25%. Okay, how and why did we do that? How
Yeah.
are we going to raise that money? Well, that's why we hired you. And
Yeah.
it goes beyond having program staff supporting grant proposals, right? A
Mhm.
true culture of philanthropy is one where everybody is a fundraiser and takes donor meetings and understands the kinds of things that donors want. And they don't have to ask for money, right? One of my favorite things to do is as a cultivation touch point stewardship is say, hey, so and so, I want to introduce you to this person on our programs team. She's got some really cool updates about this program that you funded, and I think you'd really enjoy hearing from her.
Yes.
And then two things happen, right? Your donor now has more than one touch point at the organization, which
Right.
supports retention, not just donor retention, but if staff retention, if there's staffing shifts, they have more than one point of contact.
Yeah.
They know for a fact that they're not going to be asked for money when they're talking to somebody with a different title, right? Who's just there to share updates on programs,
Yeah.
or I mean, asking marketing and communications, right? Hey, this person's been supporting our organization for X amount of years, or they were our first monthly donor and they're still giving. Like, can
Yeah.
you write a piece about them for our organization's blog?
Right.
Right? there are so many ways to implement this culture of philanthropy where everybody is a fundraiser in a way. And the problem is there's this assumption, well, not everybody can be a fundraiser because the fundraising team asks for money. And that's your biggest problem right there.
Right.
Fundraising isn't asking for money, it's building relationships.
Yes.
And everybody on your team should have relationships with your donors
Mm.
in ways that are naturally a fit for your organization,
Yeah.
And then when this plays out well, then suddenly you start getting phone calls like, I had such an amazing team conversation with so and so on your programs team. They are just amazing. I had no idea that you were doing X, and I want to make my commitment early this year, right? That's
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah.
And it's the fundraising does it works for itself. I never like to say it becomes easy, but it becomes easier
Right.
because people get more excited. And I mean, to that note, right, the number of nonprofit fundraisers who have never seen their programs in action, especially as we've shifted to more remote work
Yeah.
or more global organizations in nature, is crazy to me.
Yeah.
Because if you've never seen your programs in action, you can't talk about them. You can't
No.
raise money for them.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I was about 23 years into my career in prospect management before I ever went on a donor visit with a fundraiser. And I remember at my first organization, and I was probably, I don't know, 10 years into my role there, I raised the idea, hey, could I go with a fundraiser on this visit in Boston? It would be just a day trip, no other accommodations or anything, like it wouldn't be a huge expense. And they literally didn't know what they would say to introduce me to the donor. Like, because well, he's prospect research, and they typically are analysts looking at capacity and inclination. And I get that it'd be scary for the prospective donor, but there were ways around that. And
Yeah.
so that was shot down, and then it just never came up in other more natural ways of like, how could we integrate advancement services, prospect research, marketing communications, as you mentioned,
Mhm.
into this culture of philanthropy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And marketing and communications has a very similar trajectory when it comes to fundraising. Every time I post something, people are like, it's the same for Marcoms folks. I'm like, I know, but I don't speak to that because it's not my experience.
Right.
But it
Right.
is, marketing, communications, and fundraising are just seen as necessary expenses. They're
Yes.
not seen as investments. And it is crazy to me. I saw something on LinkedIn this morning that said, you know, 40% of organizations who invest in their branding, or organizations that invest in their branding generate 40% more revenues than organizations that don't, right? That's wild. But we see these positions as something we have to do.
Yeah.
Something that I think about a lot is that charity navigator and these watchdogs, GuideStar, they penalize organizations for spending money on fundraising.
Mhm.
When let's take a brand new nonprofit, right? You're launching a nonprofit to support X. Your first year, 100% of your time and budget should be spent on fundraising
Yes.
because you have to bootstrap it,
Yes.
right? And higher ed isn't held to this same standard, but if you think about when they start a capital campaign, they put so much money into fundraising.
Yes.
But nonprofits are penalized for doing that, right? You can't say we're a food pantry and we want to expand our reach to the neighboring 3 counties. So we're hiring 3 full-time fundraisers and launching a capital campaign,
Yeah.
so that we can expand our reach. But suddenly you do that and your rating goes down because the percentage of your budget that you're spending on fundraising has increased.
Yeah.
What?
That's
Right?
wild.
When you know that those organizations, that investment is ultimately going to generate more revenue. It will balance it out,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, I worked at an organization where the CEO was obsessed with this 80-20 ratio. I mean, my salary was cut because we exceeded the 20% threshold of what we should be spending on fundraising
Oh,
because we had just
goodness.
implemented a new CRM. And right, I mean, that's preposterous,
Yeah.
right? We penalize organizations. I understand. I know the donor mentality of this idea that donors don't want to pay for salary. I get it. The overhead myth, all of that. I
Right.
understand it.
Right.
I hear it. As a fundraiser, I hear it more than anybody else,
Yeah.
right? But at the same time, in business, we accept this. You have to spend money to make money. But in
Right.
nonprofits, somehow it's not allowed.
It's different. Yes. Yeah.
And it has ripple effects on exactly what I said about this post. Organizations treating staff as necessary evils, a line item on the expense instead of an investment that can further your mission. And that's why you see organizations have no, you know, retention problem except on their fundraising staff. And that's
Right.
why so many fundraisers are jumping ship after 16, 18, 24 months.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's an alarming trend that I think I don't know what those there is no silver bullet for it, but it's a start to have these conversations at least and raise awareness
Yeah.
of it. Yeah. Christina, we have about 10 minutes left in our airtime today. Um, I wanted to get your reaction to this quote from the civil rights activist and poet Maya Angelou. I'll share the quote first, and then just if you want to, articulate how it resonates with you, I'd love to hear that. So Maya Angelou once wrote that, quote, "I have found that among its other benefits, giving liberates the soul of the giver." End quote. I love that sentiment. So, in your experience, giving time, energy, expertise, perhaps giving money, you don't have to go into any details or name any names of organizations, but how has being a donor, a giver, enriched your life, please?
I don't see a world where this wasn't going to be my path, right? I went to an elementary school where a Catholic elementary school where community service was a requirement.
Mm,
I was a Girl Scout. And so giving time, right, was always just in it was something that I started doing at such an early age.
yeah,
And when I went to college, it was the same thing, right? I was volunteering in my local community. Today, I always ask myself, am I doing too much? Because amidst being a parent and, running a business and working, I'm a Girl Scout troop leader and encouraging young girls to do the same thing, to give back to their communities, right?
awesome.
And I think I kind of sit here at the state of the world that we're in right now and just really am so perplexed by the number of billionaires in this country who are spending money on X with no private foundation. There's no philanthropic
Yeah,
anything. And it's like, my
yeah,
God, do it for the tax write-off, if not for the generosity, right? Like,
sure.
I cannot imagine having that kind of money and not wanting to do anything good with it, not putting it to any good use.
I
And I
agree.
don't think that's because I'm like such an altruistic person. I think that's just like how you should function as a human,
Right.
right? Is to give back and to be generous. I think it does enrich your life, but I also think it's just it's what makes us human, right?
Yes.
We are we're creatures of need, right? And
Yeah.
being able to fulfill whatever those needs are for people, for the world, for the environment, the community is really valuable. And it's one of the reasons why, I decided to start a Girl Scout troop for my daughter is, to instill that with her and with her friends. And it's
Yeah.
been really fun to teach them. We gave we collected a lot of clothing for an organization, a local organization that provides transition programming for unhoused individuals, right? And so they help them get jobs and think we collected toothbrushes and clothes and a lot of stuff. And I asked the girls what they learned, and one of them said, I don't think I learned anything, but I know that I want unhoused people to have housing now, right? And it
Yeah.
was,
Wow.
this was a 6-year-old,
That's
right? And
cool.
it's like, yes, that is what you learned, right? To
Yes.
teach that and to teach these issues to kids to understand that we have to give back to the world because we are all connected in some
Yeah.
way, right? And there's no giving back because it feels good. It's just what it should be, right? And so I just the reason I went into international development, my parents are both immigrants, and both benefited from programs from organizations like care.org and international development programs, and came to this country and felt like this country gave back to them.
Oh,
So it was a huge part of my upbringing, right? Is that, to give back to the country and the programs that gave us our lives and our future here,
sure.
you
That's
know?
beautifully said.
Thank you. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
I couldn't ever envision a world that where I just was not giving back in some way, right? And I think we're seeing that shift. I don't remember the statistic, but among Gen Z job searchers,
Mm.
there is data that supports that they will choose a lower paying salary for a company or an organization that is mission driven over, more money, right? They're
Yeah.
going to work at B Corps or B Corps and nonprofits, and they want that mission, and they're pressing their companies to take a stance on certain issues. And why aren't we giving back to this? And they're taking more advantage of employee matching programs than any other generation, right? Because
Yeah.
they think it's great that I doubled my gift because my organization allows me to do that and supports that, right? And
Yeah.
so I am optimistic about things shifting that way, but I do. I think it is enriching. I think it's made me a better parent, a better nonprofit professional, right? To have that in common with, when I'm talking to somebody about a potentially large gift, it's really about what could this do for you? Why is this important, right? It's not just what can it do for our organization? It's, this is the impact and the legacy that you can have by supporting this program or organization.
Yeah. And that's a really persuasive way to frame those conversations.
Yeah, it's good
Yeah.
fundraising.
Yes. Well, Christina, our last quote and reaction from you, I think ties in really nicely to what you just articulated in your last response to Maya Angelou's quote, just about, we're here to help other people and to put good back into the environment, into our communities. So it's a nice segue from this quote by best-selling author Vex King, who wrote, quote, "My type of people are those who wish others well, remain accountable for their actions, seek growth with you, are kind to strangers, and keep it real without being unnecessarily rude," end quote. So as you got that question ahead of time, are there people in your life or in your career who come to mind as people that embody those positive attributes, and how do you try to emulate that as well?
Yeah, becoming active on LinkedIn has been such a wonderfully connective, eye-opening experience.
Mm.
There is such a scarcity mindset among nonprofits and this kind of weird, unhealthy level of competition.
Yeah.
And when I started thinking about consulting, I expected the same thing, right? I
Mhm.
expected that if I put myself out there as a consultant, I would get a lot of, oh, but I'm a fundraising consultant and I
Yeah.
already do that, and a lot of competition. And instead, it's who can I introduce you to? How can I help you? What kind of
Okay.
doors can I open for you? And LinkedIn is just this incredibly powerful community of people who just want to help others. I love when I see somebody write a post about how their job search hasn't been going well, and it's flooded with comments about, hey, we're connected to so and so and they're hiring, or just commenting for
Yes.
reach, people who genuinely just want to support somebody who's, you know, in that time.
Yeah.
Um, for me, I mean, since I started this, you know, it's really only been a couple of months. I mean, I've officially launched 4 weeks ago today, but
Awesome.
um, since I started thinking about this, really, you know, Tasha Van Vlack and the nonprofit Hive are my biggest cheerleaders. I'm a proud, you know, Hive ambassador. I think anybody who is feeling any sort of way about being in the nonprofit space should be on the nonprofit Hive and just have a free conversation with somebody
Totally.
who's in the space. John and Becky at We Are for Good are also big cheerleaders.
Yes, we are.
Courtney Harrness, I met him through a nonprofit Hive chat, and you know, he just immediately was like, "Oh, you're launching a consulting business? Let me give you some advice and some ideas." You know,
Wow.
Camilla Martin runs the Catalyst community, which is a community for nonprofit women of color consultants. And
Okay.
really, it has just been so refreshing to have break down what has always been a very siloed career for me. I mean,
Mm.
I really have not ever known other people who work in nonprofits. Um, you know, nonprofit professional development funds aren't exactly always there. And so I haven't
Right.
gone to
True.
conferences and met people, right?
Yeah.
But then I started posting on LinkedIn, and it's like I have connected with people that I now genuinely consider friends. Some of them I've met in person, others I haven't.
Yeah.
And it's really become this incredible community. And so I would encourage anybody who is feeling that siloed, like you're the only one doing this work, carrying the weight of the world of your nonprofit on your shoulders, to connect with any of those people or communities I mentioned, because I think there really is this beautiful community that's flourishing among nonprofit professionals on LinkedIn, people who really love and respect nonprofit work and want to change the sector for the better. It's a complicated sector. It's not without its issues, but it certainly isn't hopeless. And there's a lot of really fantastic people out there who are trying to shape it for the better.
Absolutely. And I think just the power of, and this may be out, and it probably is outdated, but I remember like during the pandemic, I heard from a nonprofit thought leader who said that only about, I think it was 3 or 4% of nonprofit professionals that have a LinkedIn account ever engage with content, specifically posting their own thoughts or asking questions. So just the power, if that figure is even marginally increased in the last, 3 or 4 years, just the power of, even less than 10% still, of putting out good content, as you mentioned, commenting for reach because someone's got a question or they're looking for a new opportunity or they're struggling with their own mental health and they're being vulnerable on LinkedIn. Just that magnification is really a wonderful thing to see on that platform.
Yeah, I think that statistic is probably right. I read that only 7% of LinkedIn's entire, you know, audience population, whatever you want to call it, is actively posting. There
Oh,
is
wow.
still this idea that it's just an online resume, right? And you go on it to announce your new job, look for a new job, right?
Yes.
And so, but I think it is starting to grow. There's a lot of people shifting from TikTok and moving to LinkedIn for better or for worse.
Right.
But yeah, it is it's a platform that I think because it's still pretty underutilized, there's a lot of space to grow on it.
Absolutely. And I think, for me, this is how I get connected to nonprofit leaders that I never would have the chance to meet, in real life, as you talked about meeting some of the people you've named, meeting them in real life. It's just a really awesome tool. And it's been really
Yeah.
beneficial for me to be like, hey, like, you've posted something really interesting. We want to come on my podcast and talk about it. And it's really awesome.
Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
is. I love it. I really do. It's it's just such a refreshing platform compared to other social media, right? I'm not one of those like politics off of LinkedIn, but I do like that people tend to focus on what's happening in their sector,
Yeah.
right? I think politics belongs everywhere, especially in nonprofit space.
Right.
But I appreciate that LinkedIn is becoming this space where we can challenge our sector,
Yeah.
right? I love when I hear from people who say things like, I've never thought about this before. Thanks for bringing this to my attention. It's like,
Right.
yes, that's what I'm trying to do, right? Nobody's ever really connected. We think about donor retention, but nobody's ever really thought about staff retention when it comes to sustainable fundraising. And it's not just because your relationships are falling through the cracks when staff leave, because that actually isn't true. More
Right.
often than not, when somebody is leaving, leadership jumps in to hold on to those relationships.
Yes.
It's all of the other things, the database management, right? The operations, the donor operations that
Yeah.
and the donors who aren't major gift donors, right? The
Correct.
$500 donor who falls through the cracks and stops giving because nobody reached out to them again, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it has been really powerful and fun to talk about these things and connect with people and get people to understand that this is a way that we can shape and shift our sector.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said, Christina. And I encourage people listening, watching when this interview goes live, definitely to follow you on LinkedIn for the content you put out on that platform. And thank you, Christina, for just a very insightful and fun conversation today.
Thanks, Tim. It's been great.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'm excited to follow along and hear what else you share. Because I think it's really meaningful content, both the professional and the personal. Because I still have, well, three kids living at home. Our oldest is soon to go off to college. But
Congratulations.
I think just like when I see posts by people like you and others that are bridging professional and personal and being like, oh, okay, like I've been through a certain stage in parenthood or family life, like here's something that worked for me, and being able to share that as well, it's a real benefit. So I look
Yeah.
forward to following along more.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. And for our audience, you'll be able to find Christina's conversation across these platforms later in the summer of 2025 on LinkedIn with the link to the video portion on YouTube. The audio only will be on Podbean. And thanks to my 100th guest, Luis Diaz of WISE, WIZE, and the Donor Participation Project. He is sponsoring my website, peopleinfundraising.wordifysites.com. So please look for Christina's interview on those platforms and have a great rest of your day, Christina.
Thanks, Tim.